Okay, evaluation is a big topic, and it's relevant to BARD. We're going to be evaluating networks. It's part of the process. Fundamentally, we're going to be evaluating arguments and solutions to problems, but along the way, we're certainly going to look at the value of the networks produced. So this is not, none of these slides are referring to BARD, right? These are all pre-BARD slides, effectively. So it's the more general problem of evaluating Bayesian nets. How do you do it? When you're talking about data mining, it's usually with data. So comparing a learned network. So you learn some network from, suppose you have some data set. The typical approach in data mining is you divide it into two sets, as a training set and a test set. So you learn the network from the training set, and then you test, see how good a job some method is done using the test set. And how do you assess it in terms, from the test set? The usual approach is to look at predictive accuracy and related measures. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Another thing that's done, specifically in data mining Bayesian nets or causal discovery, is that artificial data are generated from a network. That data is used to learn something using some method, so you get a new network, and then you compare the learned network from the one that actually produced the data. And the typical approach there is just to count edit distance, how many arcs do I have to delete and add and reverse and stuff to get from one network to the other. And both of these kinds of approach to evaluating or measuring learning are basically crap. So I'm going to talk about crap, but I'm going to talk about other stuff as well, at least a little bit, or at least I'll allude to it. I'll pretend to talk about it. Okay, and there's also testing with experts. So if you have a network that you've learned from real data about a real problem, you can take it to an expert and ask their opinion. You can ask that opinion in naive ways or in slightly more sophisticated ways. So there's like face validity. Does this roughly look sensible to you? But you can also ask things like, well, if you have a case of a refugee from Afghanistan who's been a health worker, and this model says the probability of that person having latent TB is 0.001, you can ask the expert, is that sensible? And the expert will say no. Okay, so you can test with experts, you can do testing with data. Expert sanity testing I just referred to. And then there are lots of different things that can be done. Sensitivity analysis, if you have a complete Bayesian network, most of these tools, or all of these tools, will give you some varieties of sensitivity analysis, which we'll talk about. There's causal information measure, which Xinhang's working on. Walkthroughs, you can walk through different cases, you can test scenarios. Okay, so elicitation review, I think that means talking to experts, basically, right? So you just, given any network and a panel of experts, you can ask them to assess the variables and whether the definitions provided make sense, whether the local structure between different subsets of variables makes sense, and you can also look at probabilities under different circumstances. Feel free to jump in.
I interpret that as a model walkthrough.
A model walkthrough.
It's a bit different.
Okay. So describe a model walkthrough for us.
Just going through the set of variables and values in the graph and just explaining all the concept part of it, and just with a group of experts to make sure that it makes sense.
Right. Well, I assume you've done this a few times. So how do you do it? Do you like start out with some root nodes and say, explain what they are and how they impact the next tier or something like that, or what? You don't have a fixed procedure.
I don't have a fixed process for this. It's something that I'd like to develop.
Okay, so anyway, model walkthroughs. Sensitivity analysis, I mentioned, okay, measuring, we're going to get into specifics on that. Case-based, so that's where you might have some paradigmatic cases that you know what ought to be happening in those cases. They can be, middle of the road cases, but they could also be extreme cases, like a 1 in 100 year flood, right? That's now a 1 in 10 year flood. Pretty soon it'll be 1 in 5 year flood. But anyway, you can look at those cases and see if the model matches the intuition of the experts. Okay, so here's some discussion of sensitivity analysis. So there's sensitivity to evidence, sensitivity to parameters. Those are very commonly supported in these tools. So that just means instead of one at a time poking the network just with your mouse and clicker, which you can do, of course, instead of setting a variable to this value and then to this value and then to this value and observing, you can ask some of the tools anyway to just run through the range of possibilities and tell you for some target variable of interest what happens to it when the whole range of values is observed. Okay, so sensitivity to evidence, that means observing different values. You can automate some of that. Sensitivity to parameters, likewise, you could always just pop into a CPT and hit a different parameter, say, I'm not sure this is 0.2, maybe it's 0.25, what happens? But instead of that, you can ask some of the tools to just run through a range of values and see what happens for all of them automatically. You save a lot of time. Sensitivity to structure and discretization. Basically, anything you can change in the model, in principle, you could do sensitivity analysis. Also here, I think, means that no Bayesian net tool actually supports this stuff, but you can dream about it. So sensitivity to structure, that would mean what happens, for example, if I just, I don't know what it means. It can mean lots of things. One thing it could mean is, suppose a particular network has an arc density of, 0.2 or something. Then you could wonder what things would look like if it was actually 0.1. And you could, more than wonder, you could automatically just go in and zap half the arcs and then see what happens. That's a little bit strange. What do you mean? This is your slide, right?
Yeah, we were trying, well, the particular instance we were thinking of is we were trying to find out which influences and arcs were actually genuinely useful on the output result. So as a whole.
Well, just going through each arc and zapping one at a time to see.
Not specific. Well, we usually pick a subset of arcs that we need to.
Okay, so there's a set of arcs, and you just iterate through all of them, and see what the effect there is when you delete each one, and then.
Yeah, never when necessary.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Fair enough. Discretization. Well, you can discretize continuous variables in Aleph-1 many ways. So actually, no tool will investigate all of those, but you can do a sample of them and look at, for example, you can look at the difference between an MDL discretization with 5 slots and one with 4 slots, and see which one's better, for example. I don't know if tool's doing that either, but obviously all of this is automatable through the API. It's lucky so many of you are programmers, so you can do all of this stuff. All I have to do is ask for it, right, and you deliver. Isn't that the way this works? Something like that. Deseparation. Okay, well, there's actually a tool that one of Anne's students built that will tell you about deseparation. You can do it intuitively on any of these Bayesian nets just by setting the values of some set of variables and then clicking on others back and forth again to see what's changing. So with your eyeball, you can see things changing. And where you see things not changing, those are the guys that are deseparated intuitively. But you can also use this little Matilda tool if you're interested, which doesn't rely on your eyeball. It just tells you what's deseparated.
You can do it in Medico.
Oh, yeah?
You can select what's deconnected and what's deseparated.
You can ask it to tell you?
Yeah, if you pick a target node.
Right. Okay, cool. Let's see, there are also measures of influence. In Netica, you get mutual information and something called variance, and I forget what variance is, but anyway, some trivial measurement of how much variance reduction, I guess, in some variable given the value of another variable, something like that. So that gives you an idea of marginal dependency. You can't do conditional mutual information, or can you? Well, I guess you can set variables and then, yeah, so you can, okay. So you can,
should do that, most people don't.
yeah, okay, so you can do either marginal or conditional mutual information and likewise variance, whatever variance is. And I have no idea how to read this table. I mean, this is either fish abundance or river flow, and that's either fish abundance or river flow, but I don't know which one is which.
So it's the fish abundance, the stats of fish abundance, and we try to, we vary the findings across river flow and we get the range of probabilities.
Okay.
So the top left corner should be 1 minus the bottom right corner of the max.
Oh, okay.
Is that right? That's almost not quite.
No.
Not at all.
It's, well, I mean,
But yeah,
for this calculator, it's about right, but I think others might differ. Okay. Anyway, the point is just that you can look at entropy reduction. What? I don't know what the point is. What is the point? Somebody tell me what the point is.
I think it's basically to see how much the target variable varies in its belief distributions for various states based on changes in some input variable.
Okay.
fine.
Yeah.
All right, this is what I'm more used to seeing out of Netica. You have a mutual information column. So this is self-information of fish abundance. With fish abundance, it just tells you what the maximum amount of information you can get about that variable is. And then this tells you mutual information between fish abundance and these other variables. And it's under whatever observations you happen to have set, which is probably nothing here. So this would be marginal. Yeah, I think Stephen should be speaking to this slide. This isn't.
Probably you could talk a little bit to the slide.
Yeah. Well, since it's not my slide and I haven't done any of this stuff,
Yeah.
why don't you stand closer to the mic?
Okay, just very quickly. So this is covering some of the more systematic approaches that you could use to doing sensitivity to parameters. So instead of plugging in, numbers and testing them, it's good to actually have a distribution over those numbers, and then sample from that distribution, and then see how that impacts the output, basically. So there's actually a couple of different approaches. So what I was talking about is variance-based sensitivity analysis. That's where you're sampling over, your priors over your probabilities. And then, so that's a very good technique if you're trying to do a sensitivity analysis on basically large numbers of parameters at once across your network. You can easily do like hundreds or, multiple hundreds of parameters and look at the interactions between them all. So there's techniques that have been developed to do that in a very kind of fast way and with a small amount of samples. And that's called variance-based sensitivity analysis. So you can apply that to Bayes nets. And we've got various tools that we've kind of developed in-house. They may end up being useful for this project at some point, or may not. It depends. So that's one possibility. I think that's quite good, but it doesn't give you a sense of how things are varying with other variables. It just gives you a kind of high-level summary of how strongly all of the input variables are interacting and in terms of their impact on the output. Yep. And then there's one at a time or n at a time types of analyses, which some of the software packages like actually Huygen do support. So you can take one parameter in a network and take another parameter, for instance, and then it will systematically vary them, and then it'll show you like a 3D graph of how it impacts on the output. And there's various kinds of related sensitivity analysis that you can do with that, where you can actually plot exactly how that output varies based on the variation in the inputs, and there's like an equation which describes it, so you can then compare the equations that you produce from that sensitivity analysis as well. So that's very quickly. Most of the stuff you have to program yourself though. If you're doing actually any real sensitivity analysis, the tools, if you've got small networks, then the one at a time and the two at a time analyses are, can be useful. But if you're doing fairly complex networks, then you have to program it. There's no real support for that kind of stuff. So, but we do have the VBSA tool. So,
Okay. Thanks. So when Stephen talks about inputs and outputs of a Bayesian net, what on earth does he mean?
do you want me to explain?
No. Any ideas?
So the inputs of the variables at the root nodes, if you like.
No, not necessarily at the roots. Inputs
Well,
are,
it could be something else there.
like it could be a symptom of a disease.
Yeah, it's true.
So inputs are the variables that you're not really interested in, but you happen to have observed. And outputs are the variables you're interested in that you haven't observed. That's basically all he means. It's not like it's a computer program procedure with an input and an output or something. It's just funny talk.
Yeah, it comes up a lot in the sensitivity analysis because you've got those, you define the kind of input variables and outputs. But
Yeah, I suppose if you're doing a sensitivity analysis, then you'll automatically have some target variables of interest. That has to be the output. And you either do or don't have input variables. Okay. Do we want to do this one? Okay. So predictive accuracy, as I mentioned before, when you've got test data, that's the primary means that data miners use to evaluate the results of learning. So with a Bayesian net, predictive accuracy is certainly easy to assess. The basic idea is you, in prediction, right, you've got some observed value, some evidence, and you have something that you're trying to predict, an unobserved variable. So in a Bayesian net, you just set the observed variables to the observed values for each case, and then you look at the target variable or variables and see what it's saying. For predictive accuracy, the typical approach is just to take the modal value of the target variable and say it's predicting that. And then you look at the test data, you complete the observation of your test data to see what the value actually was. And if it matches, it's a win. If it doesn't, it's a miss. And then you just tally up the former and divide by the total number of cases, and there's predictive accuracy. Very, very simple. All kinds of problems with that. The problem is not doing it, computing it. That's trivial. But interpreting it certainly is a problem. Okay, so Netica, everybody provides support for predictive accuracy. So here we have tests with cases. Okay, so you have some test case file, and you just tell it what the test case file is, and you tell it what the target node of interest is, and it does the summation for you. Receiver operating characteristics are very commonly used as well. These things are minor variation on or an application of predictive accuracy. It's essentially a sensitivity analysis. So you're looking at the true positive rate, how that changes as you adjust the false positive rate. So if you have a model or a learning process or whatever, where you basically have a tuner for false positive rate, you can then, or you just, doesn't matter. Anyway, you can test and get this value. So the ideal performance, a perfect model, of course, would give you a true positive rate of 100% all the time. So a really simple way of summing up an ROC curve is to look at the area under the curve. So if you integrate, the perfect model has a 1, and less perfect models have a 0 point something. A totally random model will have a 0.5. It's just randomly guessing. So anything between 0.5 and 1 is better than complete rubbish. But what does it all mean? Okay, well, it's just another kind of predictive accuracy measure. So this slide is meant to point out that predictive accuracy isn't the golden whatever. It's not the perfect standard. So, for example, in the procedure I mentioned, if you have a model for predicting edibility of mushrooms, it'll count as win if it gets a 0.51 probability of edibility and it is edible, and it'll get the same value for 0.99 and it's edible. But of course, if you think about misses, if you actually decide on the basis of a 0.51 that it's edible and you behave that way and eat the mushroom, then you're putting your life at considerably more risk than a more conservative decider, right? So the probabilities are not the same, and they shouldn't be assessed as the same. If you assess them as the same, you can't distinguish between something that's basically taking absurd risks and something that's behaving rationally. So that's not great. In particular, what's missing in predictive accuracy is a measurement of miscalibration. So if your probability predictions of 0.6 and 0.7 are just as good or just as bad as 0.9 or 0.99, then you've got a problem. And predictive accuracy is never going to tell you about that. Okay, so there are techniques around, and have been around for a long time, which do tell you about that. So Good, I.J. Good, an early Bayesian philosopher, worked with Alan Turing, came up with a technique, a score, it's a kind of log score, which basically combines predictive accuracy and calibration. So to maximize the score, here's the score for a binary case. So basically you look in your test cases to see what your model is predicting for what actually turns out to be the true class. If that probability is greater than 0.5 in the case of binary, right, then you're going to get a positive score. If it's actually 0.5, so if it's just tossing a coin, it has no idea who's going to win between Collingwood and whatever, then that's going to be 1, and you get a 0 score. And if you're completely confident in the true class, you'll maximize your chances, your score. Complete confidence in the true class being probability 1, right? Then you're going to get a 1. And if you're completely confident in what's false, then you have a log of 0, which is negative infinity. So if you're absolutely certain and wrong, right, you go to hell and you can never escape. And that is the appropriate punishment. Lots of people in data mining, you cannot convince them for some reason that that's an appropriate punishment. But the point is probabilities and betting are related phenomena. So if you're prepared to put a probability 0 on something that turns out to be true, that's the same as saying that you're prepared to bet absolutely anything, and indeed absolutely everything, that you're right. So if you bet the entire material contents of the universe on something that turns out to be false and you lose that, how can you come back? The universe is gone. There is no coming back. Those things are equivalent. So before you put down a probability of 0 or 1, think twice about that, or 3 times, or more times. You really shouldn't be doing that. And as I was suggesting before, in Bayesian nets, that really is a problem. If you have a Bayesian net where you've stuck a 0 probability in for something, and that case is encountered, all software will fail. There's no such thing as a Bayesian net that can accommodate that. Okay, so anyway, a good score is meant to be used in the case of test cases, right? So you're making predictions. Those predictions are hopefully well-calibrated, moderate, not overconfident or underconfident predictions. And if you're getting it in a binary case, you're getting it correct more often than not. So there's predictive accuracy that's not 0. Then you're going to be getting relatively more positive outcomes here than negative outcomes. And if you go extreme, then you're opening yourself up to execution. Okay, so we call that the Bayesian information reward. We generalized it beyond binomial cases, and so this is a good technique, much better than predictive accuracy or ROC, when what you've got are the training cases, test case scenario. If you have the true model, because you have artificial data, then there are better ways. But this is useful for cases where you have real data, and you can set some of it aside, and we've disappeared again. So setting some of it aside is the test case.
I think that's the last slide.
Oh, that's the last slide. You should have a fin or something so we know.
I think
We can-
the slides keep on getting shuffled around.
Ah, okay. But
you
anyway.
know, we usually do this part earlier in the day, and
All right.
I think that's why that happens.
Okay. So that was an abrupt end to the talk. Questions? Yes, if you actually have the true model and artificial data and learned models, then, as I said before, the common way is edit distance. But another thing you can do is look at the probability distributions implied by the two models and measure how far apart they are from each other. And then there are more sophisticated things to take into account the causal directions of the arcs.
I commented earlier on the psychology of elicitation and the fact that people don't always respond the way you would hope to your questions, and so we take this into account. So one of the things about zeros is that when you do ask people for probabilities, people are rather too inclined to put zero. Now there's different things you can do. I mean, you can sort of not take them seriously and put in a low probability that isn't zero, so that's kind of an artificial fix.
That's what I like to do.
Yeah, there's also other formats for asking the question that discourage it. So, for example, if you're asking for odds, like is this 1 in 1,000, 1 in a million, right? Then people are less likely to say 1 in infinity.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you make that available, they're not likely to pick that. They might pick a large number.
Sounds totally weird. Yeah.
Right.
But they might say zero.
Right. Well, that's right. But even if you make that available, well, anyway. The point is,
They're less likely to take that than to take either 0 or 1 if you give them probabilities.
Yeah, so the point is that by asking the question in a different format, you can often affect the responses. You might think logically it's the same thing as probability, and in a certain sense it is, but the way you ask the question can affect them. And on that note, there's some evidence that people are kind of find it easier to think about frequentist numbers. It's like 1 in 1,000 rather than 0.001.
Yeah, whole numbers versus fractions. People deal with much more easily.
So again, this is something that we could think about when we're eliciting.
Yeah, that's so-called Gigerenser's frequency tables. Basically, they're just decision trees where instead of talking about 0.1 chance or something and a 0.01 chance and so on and so forth, you just multiply everything by 10,000 and they turn into whole numbers, and then everybody can add and see what the numbers are. Huh? Oh, you had that? Okay.
So when we did that one.
The bottom line is that Bayes' theorem is so much more agreeable in whole numbers. Okay, yeah, sure, that's it. Yeah, so when you were eliciting probability or numbers of houses that would be burnt down or something like that, you have little tokens on a monopoly set, and everyone's happy with that.
Yeah. The other point I'd make also, if you are eliciting a number between 0 and 1 or 0 and 100 or whatever, is to apply a calibration function to that, basically.
Sorry?
Basically, you should apply a calibration function on top of it. So something that recalibrates from 0 to 1 to what they actually mean, essentially, if you can observe them over time.
Sure.
Yeah.
And then back again to put it in a Bayesian net.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Well, is everybody happy or is everybody comatose?
Yes.
Both. Okay. I didn't know you could be happy when you're comatose. It's a new state, right? Yeah, right. Okay, well, thank you.